All right, so today we're going to cover a review of the Civil War, which you guys should have covered last year in 8th grade, and then we're going to introduce this concept of Reconstruction. Okay, so starting off with our ideas about the Civil War, the first thing that we need to remember are these concepts of sectionalism and states' rights. Sectionalism is the idea that our country had become divided into sections, and before the Civil War that was the North and the South. And it was not just division over slavery. It was division over economy. The South was largely agricultural, meaning they grew crops, and the North was industrial. So the North made products. And those two different types of economies led to different wants from the government. So the North wanted things that the South didn't want. The South wanted things that the North didn't want. And so then we get into a really big issue of states' rights, and that is, what rights do the states have and what rights do the federal government have? As we approached the Civil War, the South started to believe that they did not have any power. Their individual states didn't have power, and they were losing power in the federal government because of their population. So as we approach the Civil War, we have a sectional divide between the North and the South, not just over the issue of slavery, but also over the difference of the economic structure in the country. And then there's also this division that's forming between states' rights over federal government power. A lot of the northern states favored the federal government power because they controlled the federal government, and the South was losing more and more power in the federal government. So we get to the point eventually where the South is going to secede, and the South secedes not over an issue of slavery, but over Lincoln's election. So the South doesn't leave because slavery suddenly becomes illegal. The South leaves because Lincoln gets elected. And that was the last straw in them recognizing that they didn't have any political power, because Lincoln got elected as the president even though no southern states voted for him. So Lincoln gets elected, the South secedes, and the original war, then we start fighting the Civil War over the issue of secession. Lincoln does not believe that the South has a right to secede. He doesn't think that it's something that you can legally do. So the South secedes because Lincoln's election is the final straw. They're really leaving over this idea of states' rights. Okay? So our country has become divided. They believe that they're states' right. They don't have enough power through states' rights. Lincoln gets elected, and so they leave. When the war starts, that is what the war is about. It's not about slavery. It's about this idea of secession. And that's important because there are states that don't leave, that don't join the Confederacy, that still have slaves. So if you look at like Missouri and Kentucky, these states stay in the Union, but they still have slavery. So if Lincoln came out and said the Civil War is about ending slavery right then he would have lost Missouri and Kentucky. So we start fighting. The war is about secession and states' rights. Eventually, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and it makes slavery the focus of the war. Now, the interesting thing about the Emancipation Proclamation is it doesn't actually free any slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation frees slaves in the Confederacy. Well, Lincoln wasn't considered the president of the Confederacy, so he didn't have the power to free those slaves. And the slaves that still lived in the Union, like Missouri and Kentucky, those slaves weren't freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. So what this did is it made a statement to the rest of the world that this war was now going to be about ending slavery, which was significant because you had Great Britain sitting in Europe looking at the United States and thinking they had a chance to join the South and help in the Union. Well, Great Britain had already abolished slavery, and so when Lincoln made this a war about slavery, he assured that England was going to stay out of the war. So it was really a political move as much as it was about ending slavery. It made sure that England stayed out of the war. So we're going to change it from a war on secession right here to a war on slavery after Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. The North, as the war wears on, is going to win because of its infrastructure. When we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about the ability to produce products, and specifically their ability to ship things. So the North had a way better rail system than the South did, and that was a huge part of why they win the war. So the North, through infrastructure, is going to wear down the South, even though the South had better generals, a better trained army. They were fighting on their own territory. The North is going to win the war because they just have more power long term than the South does. So the Civil War is going to end. It's going to settle this issue of states' rights and slavery. And and settle it in the fact that the war's over and the South has to give in. It does not mean that the South is suddenly going to change their attitude towards African Americans or towards the issue of state rights. Okay. So those are our themes from the Civil War. After the Civil War, we are left with trying to reconstruct the country. So Reconstruction is not so much about rebuilding the South that was demolished or fixing the North. Reconstruction is about rejoining the North and the South and making us one nation again. We have a couple different plans. Lincoln has what's called his 10% plan, and I have the word here conservative. Lincoln's plan was very conservative. These southern states had to get 10% of their state to swear loyalty to the Union before they could rejoin. Completely opposite of Lincoln's plan, you had the Radical Republicans led by Thaddeus Stevens. So the Radical Republicans come up with a very strong way that they want to deal with Reconstruction, and they want to make it much more difficult for these southern states to come back into the Union. So you've got Lincoln's plan, which he wants to make it easy because he believed that secession wasn't possible, and because of that, because it wasn't possible, he thought that it needed to be easy for these states to rejoin the country. The Radical Republicans, on the other hand, in a way, kind of want to punish the South for what they did. So the Radical Republicans, led by Thaddeus Stevens, are going to pass the Wade-Davis bill, which basically said that Reconstruction was going to be left up to Congress and not the president. And Lincoln is going to end up vetoing that bill, and it creates a pretty big divide between the president and Congress. Lincoln's plan probably would have won out because of the political power that Lincoln had, but as we know, Lincoln dies and Andrew Johnson takes over. Okay? So Johnson's going to take over, and Johnson is going to his plan's going to be really similar to Lincoln. The difference is he's not nearly as well respected as Lincoln was. He doesn't have the same relationship with Congress that Lincoln did. So Lincoln had a conservative plan. Johnson also has a conservative plan. Okay, so through this time period of Reconstruction, we're going to see quite a bit of social change. The Freedmen's Bureau is going to be established to help former slaves, so who we would call the freedmen, people who were slaves and are now free, help them gain access to all sorts of things, education, jobs, that kind of thing. Congress is going to pass the Civil Rights Act draw up the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is looking to end black codes. Black codes are established in the South after the Civil War to keep slaves or former slaves as close to in slavery as possible. So they no longer can legally have slaves, but they want to make African Americans as much like slaves as they can. So they're going to establish black codes. And we're going to have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment establishes that African Americans can be citizens, and the 15th Amendment is going to give African Americans the right to vote. So all of this is going on. The important thing to remember is that while we have this legislation, if the federal government doesn't enforce these things in the South, then they really don't do any good. So we're going to get rid of slavery, but when it comes to rights of citizens or the right to vote, the South is going to use these black codes, or what eventually will become Jim Crow laws, to keep African Americans from having their rights. And so what we know is that Congress can pass all of this legislation, but if the government's not going to enforce it, then it doesn't do a whole lot of good. So we end up our country is going to go with Congressional Reconstruction over Johnson's plan of Reconstruction. So Johnson had his plan. Johnson's plan loses out. We're going to establish Congressional Reconstruction. Congressional Reconstruction is going to make it more difficult for states to come in. It's also going to say that any states that came into the Union under Lincoln's plan or Johnson's plan, they don't get to be a part of the Union. They don't get to be a part of the Union. The only exception to that is Tennessee, because Tennessee had already ratified the 14th Amendment, which gave African Americans as well as other citizens citizenship. So Tennessee gets to stay part of the Union, but the rest of the southern states that came in under Johnson or Lincoln's plan, they don't get to. In 1866, we have the midterm congressional elections, and what's going to happen is Johnson is going to be left completely alone in the government. And what we mean by that is Johnson's a Democrat. We have radical Republicans and moderate Republicans in Congress at this point who are not going to agree with what Johnson is doing. So Johnson eventually is going to be impeached, and impeached does not mean that he's removed from office. It just means that he has charges brought against him and there's a trial. So there's a trial against Johnson. He's one vote shy of getting impeached, and General Grant is going to be elected. Okay, so we have this 1866 congressional election, which kind of leaves Johnson as a Democratic president on an island in the government. Johnson's not going to be able to get anything done, and what we're going to see come out of that is Congress is eventually going to impeach him. He's not removed from office, but it shows he really has no political power. Ulysses S. Grant, who was a Northern general, ends up being elected, and we have the 15th Amendment that is going to be passed during this time, which again is going to give African Americans the right to vote. So that's the beginning of this process of the Civil War shifting into Reconstruction. Again, you had Lincoln's plan, which was conservative. The radical Republicans had a much more aggressive plan that made it much more difficult for the South to come in. The radical Republicans' plan wins out, and that plan is going to divide the South into 5 military districts, and none of those states who thought they joined the Union are actually going to be part of the Union, except for Tennessee, because they had already ratified the 14th Amendment.